All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Tracy Fitzpatrick, and I'll be your moderator today. Thank you so much for joining us here at Netcom Learning, a market leader in promoting lifelong learning, training, and talent development solutions. We are very excited to host today's webinar, Microsoft Excel 201, Mastering Macros. And presenting today's topic is Richard Dulker. Richard is a Microsoft certified expert with over 9 years of experience as a trainer and consultant. He's been a BI analyst who works with business management and reliability of their data to come up with information capable to give them an edge over the competition. He has provided a number of trainings, webinars on business intelligence and Microsoft SQL technologies to support a variety of organizations. He has participated in the migration of the credit card system, FDR, to TSYS and was recognized for his personal contribution by the financial institution. He has been a Microsoft certified trainer and certified solution associate in SQL 2014 through 16 and business intelligence solutions. Now, please bear in mind that this is an overview of a very robust topic. We do offer a collection of technical and business courses that can be tailored towards your specific requirements. If you are interested in a further discussion, you can make an appointment with our learning consultants through our website at netcomlearning.com. Today's session is also being recorded, so you will get free access to the recording in the next 24 hours via email. And now I'd like to invite Mary Feeney, Director of our Corporate Learning here at Netcom Learning, to discuss some values and important items. Mary, go ahead.
Thanks, Tracy. Netcom Learning helps customers build innovative learning organization by achieving a smarter workforce, adapting to change, and driving growth. We do this with a broad catalog of offerings, developing customized learning plans, and our global delivery capabilities. Since 1998, we have been empowering organizations with our managed learning services to help them reach optimal performance results and address challenges. We have 9 practice areas in which we specialize. They encompass people, process, and technology training. Today's presentation is from the business application practice area. Netcom Learning offers a comprehensive training portfolio for Microsoft Excel courses. Here are our upcoming classes on our public schedule. We have Level 1 for Excel, which is scheduled on April 9, Level 2 on April 10, and Level 3 which is scheduled on April 11. We can also deliver private training to your teams, of which the learning plan can be customized to your specific needs. These offerings can be found with a simple search on our website at netcomlearning.com. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Tracy.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. And so why should you all want to attend this webinar today? An incredibly powerful but seldom used functionality of Excel is macros, which can very easily create automated tasks and custom logic. Macros can do pretty much anything and saves time on repetitive and predictable tasks without having to write a single line of code. Macros can replace actions that you do manually, like manipulating data and text, communicating with data sources, calculating totals, or creating entirely new documents with just a few clicks. In this live online session, you can learn what macros are and the entire process of creating them. And now I'd like to give you a quick overview of the logistics before we get started. To begin with, you do have the option to adjust the window size to your liking. Simply hit the Escape key and find the Zoom button on the top left corner of your GoToWebinar viewer. Everyone has been muted except for our presenters. Please feel free to submit any questions you have for the presenters here in the questions pane, and we will address them at the end of the session. A PDF copy of today's slides are also in the handout section of your GoToWebinar viewer. And now I would like to pass it over to Richard, who will be presenting today's webinar. Richard, go ahead, you are live.
Hello everyone, I'm Richard and I'll be your instructor for today. We're studying with today's class Microsoft Excel 201 about mastering macros. Sorry. Now, to get started, what is a macro? A macro is an automated input sequence that imitates keystrokes or mouse actions. A macro is typically used to replace a repetitive series of keyboard and mouse actions and are common in spreadsheets and word processing applications like Microsoft Excel and Microsoft Word. We're going to get in depth with this later. But as an overview, a macros is a list of actions that get defined so that you can execute them later, so you can automatize your work. About the course, we're going to start with understanding macros. Then we're going to talk about how to record a macro. Then we're going to run macros, how to know, we're going to know how to run macros and how to use shortcut keys to run them fastly and using buttons. Then we're going to see how to debug macros. When we're working, we're going to have some troubles while developing macros. They might need some debug, so we're going to see how to troubleshoot them. And finally, we're going to have a question Q&A session with the speaker, that's me. So please, as Tracy mentioned before, we'll need you to write every question you have in the questions panel. Understanding macros. A macro is similar to a computer program. It consists of a series of instructions that the computer follows in a sequence you specify. The macro is given a name that is used to run the instructions it contains. Excel provides two general ways to create a macro. Record a macro using the macro recorder, or the other method is to write a macro using the VBA editor. VBA stands for Visual Basic for Applications. It's a special version of Visual Basic Framework. There's two big points we need to take in here. Recording a macro using the macro recorder, it's pretty useful for making basic macros. It's for people that don't know how to code, and it will help us start learning how to code with VBA editor. VBA editor can give us a lot more functionality, but you need to master it first. Now, this is one of the versions of Microsoft Excel where you can use the Tools menu and go into Macro and click on Macros. There you're gonna display the Macros window. One thing that is really important to mention is in some version of Excel, the newest ones, you need to go into File, Options, and Ribbon Configuration, Ribbon Customization, so you can activate the menu up here for the developers functions. In there, there's gonna be macros, record macros, and a button for the panel of the VBA editor. So if you can see it in your application, that's what you're gonna need to do, because it comes as Excel comes as with a standard configuration, but hides some of the advanced functions that you need to show them. Creating a macro. When you create a macro, you have the opportunity to start in any of three places. Personal macro workbook. It means the macro is stored in a special workbook that contains only macros. So you can have a file, you can have a workbook that only contains macros to use it as a reference for every single workbook you make. You can centralize all of your macros. That will help you a lot when working, because you can just distribute that macro workbook with your workmates, and you're all gonna have the chance of using those functions and, well, the macros while working. You can also save in this workbook. You can add a macro to the current workbook you're working with. That's the most common use and the most standardized, because sometimes you just want it to use once. It's simple automatization for a fast work. But you can also ask to create the macro in a completely new workbook in the window. Now, there's something really important to note here. The text there below. You need to have the workbook open to be able to work with the macros from that from that workbook if you are containing them in other workbook than the one you are working with. That will be in the case of using a personal macro workbook. We're gonna talk about how to use them later, the macros of other workbooks, but hold on that for a little minute. Now, how to record a macro. If we use this menu, the one displayed right now, you click on Tools, Macro, and click on Record Macro. What does this mean? When you click on macro, the inputs you give in your worksheet are gonna be recorded. So once you stop using the macros, those commands are gonna repeat themselves when you press play the macro execute. This will help you give fast formats or process specific functions, process automatic functions for your worksheet. And sometimes you can even use special controls to change the way the content is calculating inside of the worksheet. The other way is to create a macro using the VBA editor. It is displayed in here. As you can see, it is bare code. It might look kind of complex if you look at it right now and you have had no experience with any kind of code, but believe me, it's pretty simple. And the macro recorder gives you the same content. You can open the macro you recorded to see how the code was recorded behind. How to record a macro. The macro recorder is a very useful tool included in Excel VBA. Records every task you perform with Excel. All you have to do is record a specific task once. Next, you can execute the task over and over with the click of a button. The macro recorder is also a great help when you don't know how to program a specific task in Excel VBA. Simply open the Visual Basic editor after recording the task to see how it can be programmed. Just as I mentioned, you open the VBA editor, open the macro you recorded, and it's gonna show the code that was recorded before. Now, on how to recording. When you click the Record Macro button, the window Record Macro, it's gonna show a few of controls. First, you give the macro a name. This is really important because sometimes when we're working and we're in a rush, we tend to use default names like the one shown here, macro 1. And as we're in a rush, we don't give the value it deserves for the right name. But once time passes and you need that one macro again, you're gonna have a lot of troubles searching for it if some time has passed. So try to be really specific on how to name your macro. If it calculates the average for a specific kind of amount, you just name it like that. So it can be as describable as you can. Now, once you enter the name, you can store the macro in, as I mentioned before, the personal macro workbook, a new workbook, or this workbook. In this drop-down list, you pick the option you need, and when you click on OK, it will create itself in the place you selected. You click OK, and the macro will start recording. So let's give an example here. If you choose a few columns with numbers, if you right-click the range you selected and then click on Format Cells, the Format Cells window is going to open and you configure it to be a specific format for a number. This is going to get recorded as an action for your macro. The macros run step by step, so every action you make, it's going to record as a step or a line of code. It works linearly. You can add some other functionality to change the behaviors, but for now, this is the one you're going to use. And once you stop making the actions you want to record, you click OK, and you click the stop recording button, and the macro it's gonna get saved. When the macro is saved, you can click on the macros button that is here, so that the macros window opens. When it's open, you're gonna get a list, and if you click on Edit Macro, the VBA editor it's gonna show with the window of the macro we're currently working with. So macro 1 was saved, and what we did was change the format of a specific cell in this case. Now, as you can see in the code, it defines the macro 1. It defines macro 1, and it executes the number format with this pattern for this selection. Every time we execute this macro, the cell we have selected, it's gonna change that. It's gonna assign that specific format for number format. Now, the macro is already recorded. The next step you need to do is run it, if you want to, of course. So if we use this example, you can enter numbers between 0 and 1. Then you select the numbers, in this case, the percentage, you select all of them as a range. And once you have selected the range, you open the developer tab and open the macros window. When you open the macros window, like in here, the list of macros we have already recorded are gonna display. Once the list of macros is displayed, you're gonna see these controls. There's the run button, step into button, and the edit I mentioned before to show the VBA editor. So you click run, and the macro it's gonna execute. So these cells that are selected are gonna change their format to the pattern that was defined before. So the result is gonna be this. The only action we executed while recording the macro was change the format of the selection. So if we select this specific range and execute the macro, that's all it's gonna do. Now, there are several ways of executing a macro in your workbook. The macro will have been saved in your macro enabled workbook or in your personal macro workbook that you can access from any workbook as you had learned earlier. As mentioned before, you don't have to use macros that are only in the current workbook. You can store them in other places, or if you if you have the Excel open, the workbook, you can load them in this drop-down list. All open workbooks, you click and you choose other options. Now, you can run a macro in the following ways. You can run a macro from the View tab. You can run a macro by pressing Ctrl and a short key. You can run a macro by clicking a button on the Quick Access toolbar. You can run a macro by clicking a button in a custom group in the ribbon. You can run a macro by clicking on a graphic object from the Developer tab and from the VBA editor. There's a lot of options, but we're gonna just cover some of them. How do you run a macro with shortcut key? You assign a shortcut key, Ctrl plus the key you've chosen for the macro. You can do this while recording the macro in the Create Macro dialog box. Otherwise, you can add this later in the Macro Options dialog box. Adding a shortcut key while recording a macro you have to click the View tab or the Developer tab, click on Macros. When you click on Macros, the window for Macros is going to show with the list. You select the record macro from the drop-down list to record a new macro. When you create a new macro, you're going to fill the information, and you type the macro name. Then there will be a field where it shows Control plus and a text box. In that text box, you input the shortcut key, and that's all. Once you save it, when you press Control and that shortcut key, it's going to execute what you recorded. Here's the example. As you can see, you click the View tab and the macros, the window is going to open. Here it is. You can select the macro and configure it in the options. It's going to show like this. This is the name of your macro, and this is the one control I mentioned before. Once you put the character you want to use, the key you want to use with your shortcut, you can add a description also for your macro. You click OK, and that's all. Next time you press Control Q, like here, it's gonna execute automatically. The macro dialog box appears. Type a letter, say Q, and the blah 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 blah. We have already covered that. And once you click OK, it's done. Now, inserting a VBA control and assigning a macro to it makes your work look professional. You can insert VBA controls from the Developer tab on the ribbon. First of all, what are VBA controls? When you work with software, there's common controls you use like buttons, drop-down lists, or radio buttons, checkboxes, and everything. These kind of controls can be added to Excel using the VBA controls. To use them, you click on the Developer tab on the ribbon. You click Insert in the Controls group, and a list is going to display with all of the possible controls you're using. In this example, you select the button icon under Form Controls from the drop-down list. Then you click the cell on the worksheet where you want the Insert button control. The Assign Macro dialog box appears. Click the macro name and click OK. Now, when you pick the button control in the development insert control, you click here, for example, and it's going to automatically add the button. When the button is added, the macro window is going to show, and it will let you pick which macro you want to execute when interacting with that button. Button on your worksheet, you can right-click on the button, click Edit Text, and type Run Macro as the text that's going to show instead of button 2. You can format and resize the button and the text of it. Now, once you've finished editing it, the button is going to start working automatically. Anytime you press that button, the macro is going to execute just as it works usually when you open the macro window and click Run. You can use it as much times as you want, and it is a really easy way to, to give fast access, quick access to complex processes that you want your workmates or yourself to use constantly. So you don't have to go into the developer console, you don't have to go into the macros window and other stuff. You also can change the format of the structure of the worksheet you're working with, the way things calculate and other stuff. Now, well, before we get into there, there's one thing I like to mention. when you put a control like a button, it's gonna start working automatically. So if you click on it, you're not gonna edit it, it's gonna execute. So I don't remember the right key, but to select it and edit it, you can right click on it and change the text, change the size, move it from position. Remember that, because sometimes you're gonna have a if you forget it, you're gonna have a few problems if you need to reposition your controls. It's the fastest way to do it. Debugging macros. Now, you've learned that the macro is stored as VBA code in Excel. You have also learned that you can directly write code to create a macro in the VBA editor. However, as with the case with any code, even the macro code can have defects and the macro may not run as you expected. This requires examining the code to find the defects and correct them. The term that is used for this activity in software development is debugging. So sometimes the macro you record or program doesn't behave the way you want. As it is automatized, you don't know where the problem is when you just execute it. So you use the debugging tools from Excel so you can keep track of everything that's happening in your macro while it executes. You can check the values of the stuff that it's being edited, or you can simply see how the macro was recorded to know if something went wrong. The VBA debugging. VBA editor allows you to pause the execution of the code and perform any required debug task. Following are some of the debugging tasks that you can do. You can do stepping through the code. So when you click the button of execute the macro, or you just execute it from the macro window, it will stop at the start and it's gonna wait for you to command it to continue. This works because you can see step by step what's happening to everything in your macro, and there you can follow when something weird happens with the behavior. You can use breakpoints. That means you're gonna select a line of the code, check it, and when it's marked, when the macro gets there in execution, it's gonna stop, so you can follow what happened there. You can back up or move forward in the code. You can pick not stepping through each line of code, so it just keeps on going. You can query anything while stepping through the code, and you can hold the execution. So while you are executing, you might not want for it to keep executing, so you can stop it. Once it's stopped, you press the stop button, and once you press it, it won't execute anymore and it won't debug anymore until you request it once again. Now, stepping into the code from the workbook. To step into the code from the workbook, you need to do the following. You click the View tab or the Developer tab, click Macros. The macro dialog box is going to show. Then you select View Macros from the drop-down list. The macro dialog box appears. It will be this, sorry. Click the macro name, the one you're working with, and click the Step Into button, this one. Before we press the Run button, it just executed the macro. Now we're gonna click on the Step Into button, that it's gonna automatically stop the execution in the first line, so you can start debugging step by step your macro. Now, once you press the button of Step Into, VBA editor is going to open and the macro code will appear in the code window. The first line in the macro code will be highlighted in yellow color. Now we press the Step Into button. This window is going to open and it's going to show the code for our macro. So this is where the macro starts. This is the name of the macro. In this case, it's called Report Project XYZ. This is just a comment for this won't execute. These ones are the lines of code that were recorded from our macro. So each time we press next step, it's gonna jump to the next line and stop once again. If we want to see the values of some stuff, or for example, active sheet, you just hold the mouse over it and it's gonna show in a context text, a tip. It's gonna open a tip and it's gonna show the value of the active sheet, and you keep on going, following the execution until you see something weird happens with your behavior, with the macro, and then you can see the results. If you press play here, it's going to continue fast until the end. Stepping into the code from the VBA editor. To step into the code from the VBA editor, not from the worksheet, you do the following. Click the developer tab on the ribbon, click Visual Basic, the VBA editor opens. You click the module that contains the macro code. Here is model 1, for example, or it might be the worksheet or the whole workbook. Now the macro code will appear in the code window. Click the Debug tab on the ribbon. Select Step Into from the drop-down list. It's here, Debug, Step Into. And that's it. It's gonna show just like before. In the first line is gonna turn yellow because it's stopped right there, and you can start debugging from there. So debugging macros. While debugging macros, you can back up or move forward in the code. You can skip a few lines of codes and you can go back to execute specific lines, or you can skip some, how to say it, some steps. You can pick not stepping through each line of code. You can just keep playing along, and you can use breakpoints to stop the execution, as mentioned before. There's one thing that I'd love to mention that I didn't put here. When the macro is stopped for debug, you're gonna see a small yellow arrow in the left. Now, to use that small yellow arrow, you can click on it and move it in this bar in here. So if the line of code currently executing is this selection.merge, you can click the arrow and drag it up there, so all of this block executes once again. If it were there and you don't want this code to execute, click it and drag it down, let's say to this line with blah 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 blah. So this will help you skip specific lines that you believe that are causing the problem, or you don't want to execute those lines because it doesn't let you debug because of some logic reason. I don't know. It depends completely from the macro you're recording. And to add breakpoints to your macro, if you wanted to stop in a specific line of code in the same area where the yellow arrow is displaying, you just click it, and a red circle it's gonna display. The line is gonna get colored red, so you know there is a breakpoint. Next time the execution passes there, it's gonna stop. So you can start debugging step by step. You can see the values of what's happened and other stuff. Now, using watch. You can add a watch while debugging to evaluate an expression and stop the execution when the variables attains a specific value. This means that you configure a watch expression which will be monitored until it is true, and then the macro will halt and leave you in break mode. VBA provides you with several watch types to select from in order to accomplish what you're looking for. What does this mean? When you are debugging, I'm gonna go back here. Let's say I want to know when some value changes. I want the macro to stop when a specific variable or a specific data is changed. So what you do is, for example, in the active sheet, for example, in the active sheet, you want to know if it is changing. You right click on it and select add watch. When you click on add watch, it's gonna display you in a list the name of the property you're trying to watch, and once its value, it's gonna stop, like in here, like with a breakpoint, and in that list you can see the value of it, so you can keep track if in any moment the value of some variable is changing and you're not planning it. You can notice it. Now, halting the execution. During debugging, at any point of time, if you have found a clue on what is going wrong, you can halt the execution to decipher further. If you are an experienced developer, the debugging terminology is familiar to you, and VBA editor debugging options make your life simple. Even otherwise, it will not take much time to master the skill if you have learned VBA and understand the code. Working with VBA might sound complex at start because, well, it's code, and if you have had no experience with code, you might think it's really hard. There's basic principles you need to know about, well, coding. First of all, the execution is linear. Once you run the macro, it will go from the top to the bottom, line by line. So if you need a value to exist, you need to define it in a line, in some line before that, in a preceding line. That's one of the most complex things you're gonna need to know, other than the syntax of VBA. But here's the thing. Remember, if you record a macro with the macro recorder, it's going to automatically fill the code of the macro. So the code that is recorded, you can open it at any time, check the syntax, know how it is structured, what does it do. So when you want to know how to do something in code that you need to do, you just do it by hand. You start the recorder, you start modifying the values, you create your macro by using the macro recorder, and once you have the macro recorded, you can edit it, get into the editor, and once in the editor, you can view the code that it generated. So the steps you recorded are going to be there with the right syntax, with the right values, so you can know how to use them next time if you don't want to use the macro recorder. I recommend this for one reason. It gives you a lot more functionality, and it will help you, let's say, upgrade the way you work as a professional in your area, because it's always better to have more skills, even if they seem too much. It might come in handy later, like in the case of the VBA editor. You don't have to be a developer to master it. You can just start learning. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of video. There's a lot of tutorials. We have a lot of consultants like the ones here that you can take courses so you can learn how to use that specific technology. Please don't be scared of VBA. Try to use it the most you can. Well, this was the theory of this. I'm gonna make a little bit showcase of how to do all of this in Excel. Hold me for a little minute there. I'm gonna get. Oh, I didn't open Excel. I'm really sorry. This is my version of Excel. This is a practice I made before. Now, take a look at this. This table. This table has specific values for the teams of boys and girls. Now, if we want to record the macro to automatize something, let's say, as shown before, change the format of the numbers. In this case, there's no reason, but there's no problem with that. I get into the developer ribbon, and I have the record macro. Mine is in Spanish. I'm really sorry. So when I press record macro, the macro change number format, here I can capture the hotkey I want to use. For example, in this case, N. It will be for this book. I will add no description. Now, the macro, if I choose this format, this range, sorry, and right-click on it and with numbers, I give it percentage format. It's gonna show like that. When I stop recording, the macro is already saved. Now, if I change the format once again, I can now use macro. Let's say I want to use it in here. I get into macro, change number format, and when I execute, the range I selected before that was recorded, I thought it will change this range, but it changed all of this because that was what was recorded. For example, that will be the right example of what I need to debug. So I want to know why all of this was changed and not what I selected. So I can get into change number format. I can click on modify. This is the window for VBA, and this is the macro I recorded. Now, with this code, it says specifically to choose the range from B2 to C6, the one I selected before. It gives a select. Then the selection format, it's a number format of this pattern. And this was an extra recording, but it's actually not doing anything. And it ends. So let's say I want to go step by step into this. I go into debug, step by step. Oh, sorry. There. Now, it stopped right there. It's not executing anymore. You can see it's paused. So I can press F8 to get into the next line. I press F8 once again and once again. If I want the past lines to execute, I drag this arrow back and I can execute them once again. Also, if I were here and I don't want the selection to happen, I can drag it down. So it will skip this execution. This comes in really handy when you want to alter the behavior while debugging, only while debugging. Now, if I press F5, it's gonna end its execution. Now, how about breakpoints? As I mentioned before, I just click on the specific line I wanted to stop. Then I press on run, and it stopped on the breakpoint. That way, I can make it stop exactly in the line I want it to. And that's most of it. As you can see, the hotkey for this is Control plus N. So if I go back to my example and change the format here, once again, if I press Control N, oh, sorry, I'll let this running. It was executing, so I can't execute anymore. Let's get back into this. Now, this is for me the big overview of what I want this to be. We saw everything there is to. Now I'd like to get into the Q&A. If Tracy, can you help me with this?
Thank you so much, Richard. That was very informative, but I'll get back to you in just a few minutes. Got a few announcements, and then we'll get into those questions, okay? So I'm going to put up some slides for our viewers and let them know about some fabulous things that are going on at Netcom Learning at our anniversary, as we do celebrate our 20th anniversary to serve you with the best in class IT and business certification training. We bring you unbeatable 20th year celebration offer this month to make your learning even more fantastic. We are offering up to 50% off on some of our popular courses. Netcom Learning offers a comprehensive portfolio for Microsoft Excel courses, which you can see up there on your screen, so do take advantage of that. We have team training that can be customized and accelerated to meet your organization's specific needs. Contact us today to be connected to one of our learning consultants to help advise you on your specific needs, or you can email us at webinar@netcomlearning.com and search our catalog at www.netcomlearning.com. And we all know that technical skills are necessary to empower your career, but do you need to improve or upgrade your leadership skills as well in order to accelerate your career? Along with your technical abilities, you can develop the skills you need to manage yourself, others, and business better. Welcome to Starter Learning, a collaborative knowledge platform bringing the world's best business and leadership insights from Fortune 1000 leaders, best-selling authors, and Ivy League professors. Further, if you're interested in learning from the top American leaders, please log on to the e-learning platform, starterlearning.com, and avail the special promotion meant for first-time users. Use your coupon code SARTER10 and begin your leadership journey now. And right now, we are going to launch a quick poll to find out how many people might be interested in taking some additional training. So just spend a few minutes to fill that out before you all log off and have to get back to work. We would appreciate that. In addition, we do have a lot more informative webinars coming up. You can go to netcomlearning.com/webinars in order to register. And don't forget to follow and like our social media pages to get the latest technology updates. You can refer to the GoToWebinar chat window for all of our links. We have Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Google+. And finally, Richard, let's get to some of those questions. First one is a two-parter, and it starts with, this is from Gon. He would like to know, while recording a macro, if you leave your desk for a while, say 10 minutes, come back and finish the recording, will the macro just ignore that absent time when you execute the recorded macro? A similar question for what happens if you switch between MS Excel and other programs while recording the macro.
Well, I've specifically never tested if the macro stops. For starters, I don't think it will be a good practice, because you can lose control of what you're doing. I believe it does ignore what you're doing while away. It only records the commands that are executed within Excel. So if you record that macro It will only say what you did in the window. So if you leave, doesn't matter what you're doing outside, it won't affect the macro. But I don't know, to be sincere, I've never tested it, if there's a time limit for inactivity in macro. What I can say is I don't recommend it.
Okay, next question is from Jane. She'd like to know, can a macro be written to grab data from separate multiple Excel files and populate an existing table?
Well, what macros do is record the actions you do in your Excel, in your worksheet. So if what you do in the code is reading from other workbooks with the functions and the sorry, not the functions, but the formulas that read from other sources, you can do, because a macro will record everything you can do with Excel. So yeah, you can.
Okay, do you have any other final thoughts before we end today's webinar?
All right, I have a bit of tips. First, about the VBA, as I mentioned before, I highly recommend getting in depth with it. I've met a few people that have done great things for their businesses while administrating with using macros. And curiously, it's the administrators or the directors that use them to automatize their work so they can fastly use everything that they usually make by hand. So it takes more time, they automatize it, and it works great for them. Some national radios, I've met some guys that do it commonly, so I assure you, you are gonna take a real big advantage of it. Once you get into VBA, I do recommend first, try to make the code, if you're using it by hand, the cleanest way possible. There's a lot of standardized naming and format conventions that you can get informed about from Microsoft and Learning and other stuff. So one of the things that you're gonna have to do is be really careful with the naming of everything. When you have a file with the standard name, most probably you will lose it. If it's called Excel Worksheet 1, you don't know what it contains. If some time passes and you forget about it and you need it, you won't find it again. Same happens with the code and with your macros. You can define variables. You can define macros, and well, when you do that, if you don't give it the right name, descriptive, clean name, you're gonna eventually have troubles with it, because you might be working with it and you might know how to use it, but if you work with some other people, if some other people tries to use your macros, they won't even know what they are. They don't know what they execute. The other thing I'd like to recommend is that there's a command line called option explicit. What is this? When you define a macro, the code opens, and on the top you put those words, option space explicit. What this does, if you are going from beginner to advanced VBA developer, is every variable you use needs to be declared before. It will give more strict follow-up of what you're doing with the code. What does this work for? When it is strict, it will not let you do wrong things. when you create variables with the same name, if you don't do that, or you use variables that you don't have declared, they are going to create new variables, and it's going to be a lot of errors, because sometimes you want to read a variable but you're using the wrong name, and the value is not what you want. So using option explicit command at the top of your code, it's a high recommendation. It's a little bit advanced. You can get more information on the internet, but you really have to, so you can upgrade the way you work with VBA. The other thing I like to add is about comments. As you saw before, I mentioned there are comments. You can see the format using a single apostrophe. It's an apostrophe, I believe. With that, whatever you put in that line, it's not going to get executed. So there you can give descriptions to every line of code, to every macro you're using. That's going to give a lot of readability for future workers or for yourself once you've forgotten about that worksheet and you're needing it once again. As macros are automatized, once you have them defined, you stop using them. So when you need to extend its functionality, you might have some troubles finding, well, code you haven't touched for about a year because your macro was great and it kept being used for a year and you didn't change it. So having comments will tell you, using comments, you can tell yourself, you can talk to yourself from the future what you need to know. So use them the most you can. And the last thing I will recommend is indent. Indenting the code. This is a programmer's basic. Really, it makes it really more readable. As you saw in the, well, while you record macros, you'll see the way it is supposed to be indented. Some lines of code are gonna start being written a few tabs to the right to show that they are contained within other functionality options from the code. So right now you might not value it, but once you use it, you can give a lot more of maintenance to your macros and everything related to the VBA editor. And once again, I have to repeat it, try and get into the VBA editor. Recording macros is great, but using the VBA will help you a lot more. That will be my recommendation. Those will be my recommendations.
Well, thank you so much, Richard, and thank you all for joining us today. If you do come up with any additional questions, feel free to send them to webinar@netcomlearning.com at any time. We hope that you found today's webinar informative, and we look forward to seeing you back here with us soon. Feel free to tell your friends and colleagues about our webinars and other courses. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure, and thank the team of the organizers. Tracy, thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed and try learning the most you can.